Good evening, everybody, and welcome to tonight's event, the second in our fall 2023 public program series. My name is Robert Levitt, and I am the acting dean of the faculty. I'd like to thank you all very much for joining us this evening. But before we proceed, I'd like to acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional home of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. As many of you may know, the name of the avenue on which the faculty sits, Spadina, comes from Anishinaabe and means a place on a hill. This site was also an important trail for several First Nations. As an institution committed to promoting truth and reconciliation, we note this history, and we wish to honor these connections as we move forward collectively. And now, to tonight's proceedings. To introduce the speaker, David Gissen, I'd like to hand the podium over to Professor Mason White, Director of the faculty's Master of Urban Design program, as well as our post-professional programs. Mason will be moderating tonight's event. Please help me in welcoming Mason White.
Thank you, Robert, and welcome, everyone. Good evening to you all, and welcome to tonight's lecture. It is my distinct pleasure to welcome Professor David Gissen back to Toronto to give a talk on his recent book, The Architecture of Disability, published by the University of Minnesota Press just this past year, which in fact is also one of the 3 books as part of our Community for Belonging reading group, which has a discussion around this book and 2 other books on October 17th at 4 o'clock in the Zeidler Library. David Gissen is Professor of Architecture and Urban History at the Parsons School of Design, New School University in New York City. In addition to 2022's The Architecture of Disability, he is the author of Manhattan Atmospheres, Architecture, the Interior Environment, and Urban Crisis, also published by University of Minnesota Press in 2013. As well, he is the author of Subnature, Architecture's Other Environments, published by Princeton Architectural Press in 2009. Gissen has held distinguished faculty positions at Columbia University Graduate School of Architecture, Preservation, and Planning. He was the Eero Saarinen Visiting Professor of Architecture at Yale University, University Professor at the Institute for Art and Architecture, Academy of Fine Arts, Vienna, Austria, and Visiting Professor of Architecture History in the PhD program in the HTC, or History Theory Criticism of Architecture and Art, at MIT. He is the recipient of numerous grants, including 4 from the Graham Foundation, which might be an individual record. I'm not sure, we'll have to fact check that afterward. And has exhibited his work and research widely, including the Venice Biennale in 2016 and 2021, the Canadian Centre for Architecture, and the Center for Architecture in New York. As you can already tell, David Gissen is many things: a designer, a historian, a theoretician, an educator, a design consultant, a critic, a curator, a researcher, an artist. He is somewhat of an expert at moving within and between the interstices of non-aligned communication mediums. Just as he can operate in these roles singularly, he also operates within their hyphenated capacity, such as architect, curator, or historian, designer. Equally, he is adept at moving across scales. Contrary to what others might simply describe as from furniture to the city, or small, medium, large, extra large, SML-XL, Gissen operates from the microscopic, including particulate matter, to the territorial, including geographic space-times. At the core of his work, Gissen is deeply curious and skeptical about the architectural production of nature, atmosphere, and abilities. He is invested in revealing alternative histories of the built environment, and it's worth pausing on this term, quote, built environment, often used by others somewhat generically as if it is an interchangeable stand-in with the discipline of architecture itself. But to Gissen, quote, built environment is not just architecture. Built environment also carries with it socio-natures, biocapacities, and disabling environments. but also specifically dankness, ramps, weeds, stairs, puddles, and impairment as its architectural byproducts. Gissen's interest in, quote, architectural production is central to his contribution to the discipline. He is asking us to reflect on what else is it that architecture produces under its surface. And maybe, most importantly, what does architecture produce unintentionally, and what are its effects? Through the unique disciplinary work advocated by Gissen, quote, architecture will begin to show how environments are historical constructions versus natural ones, end quote. Gissen has reflected on a pile of rubble. He's read the Hollywood sign and the smog. He's had an architectural theory of pollution, and he's recontextualized experiences of architectural and urban impairment. Please join me in welcoming Professor David Gissen to the podium here at Daniels faculty once again.
I was remarking earlier, thank you, Mason, for that very nice introduction, that this is one of the few podiums that I've seen with a ramp, so I probably should have used that in solidarity with others who require that. Okay, let me just get set up here. Okay, back up. It's really nice to be back here. I haven't been back, I think it's been 10 years, so it's really nice to see you in this beautiful new building and in this really grand lecture hall, so thank you. Okay, let me see. Okay, so I want to use this time to take you through some of the key ideas and objectives of my new book, The Architecture of Disability. So in a sense, I want to explain to you why I wanted to write this book. I also want to describe how I wrote it and introduce you to some of its more unusual characteristics as an architecture book and some of the methods that I turned to that tried to bring a disability perspective, my perspective as a disabled person, into the writing of it. And then I'll conclude by showing you some ideas in one of its chapters, the first chapter about architectural history. So one of my primary goals with this book was to create what I call an architectural theory of disability, and that was comprehensive. And so by that I mean that I wanted to write a book about architecture and disability that engaged subjects typically found in other works of architectural theory. So I assume, of course, all the faculty in here have extensive training in architectural theory, but I assume most of the students also take courses in architectural theory, so this is, a familiar subject for many of you. So typically, works of architectural theory outline an author, an architect's approach to many different subjects. One is often the history of architecture, the problems of cities and architects' role in urbanization processes. Another important topic is aesthetics and the creation or the way that one creates quote-unquote architectural form. And then many works of architectural theory reflect on ideas or ethics around construction and what architects call tectonics, or a kind of philosophy or aesthetics of construction. And then more and more we see in works of architectural theory today reflections by architects, historians, and theorists on architects' relationship to nature and environment, an obviously increasingly important topic, but one that you can see has very deep roots and history within architectural writing. So comprehensive books of architectural theory create a kind of, I would call like a world of values and ideas that other architects, other writers, historians, other theorists can develop and expand, appropriate, or even use as a kind of toolkit, as a way to think about how they might want to direct their own practices. This has been my kind of relationship with this genre of writing throughout my whole career. So what I would call an architectural theory of disability simply offers a disabled lens on many of the topics I just mentioned. So for example, in this book, and that I hope you all have a chance to read, I use terms like impaired monuments to think about disability in architectural history. I use the term the urbanization of disability in my discussions of cities and urban design. I use the term weaker natures to describe a kind of environmentalism that emerges from a disabled perspective. And that connects to many of the things that Mason White just mentioned, and a very, like a kind of ongoing theme in my own work, trying to challenge ideas of biological normality that architects inadvertently or intentionally advance in their work. And then when thinking about architectural aesthetics, there's work in the book on the idea of how do we disable form, and maybe it's not something I'll talk about extensively tonight, but maybe during the Q&A I explain more about what I mean by that. And then finally, the term the construction of disability when thinking about theories of building and tectonics and how they may relate to experiences of impairment. Sorry, I've been on a bit of a lecture tour lately, so my voice is not what it was a month ago. Okay, so I would contrast an architectural theory of disability to the way architecture writers typically address the topic of disability. So typically, disability is presented as a self-evident architectural problem of access and increasing the accessibility of space. This is actually a very important diagram. This is one of the first diagrams showing the range of motion of a person sitting in a wheelchair. The date on there is from 1976, the date it was published, but it was actually drawn years earlier by Selwyn Goldsmith. So works examining the problems of access often examine the disconnects between disabled people's bodies and the functioning or the relative functioning of existing and future buildings and built spaces. A quote-unquote accessible building is one that disabled people can use fully, but also one in which the tensions between the needs, the kind of functional needs of disabled people, and the space that they utilize disappear. So in developing what I call an architectural theory of disability, I didn't just want to complement a historic focus on the problem of access in architectural writing with my own ideas, which is sort of maybe, let's say, beyond the problems of access. I also wanted to air some of my own frustrations with the kind of functionalist bias and basis of most approaches to access. So a functionalist interpretation of architecture suggests that a building can be designed to optimize or promote a specific task, often defined in biomechanical terms. Late 19th century French writing and early and mid 20th century German language writing on architecture all illustrate the influence of mechanical biology on architecture. Terms like use, fitness, circulation, range of motion, among many others that were introduced into architectural writing at this time become more common. This is, I could choose any diagram, but this is a diagram by German architect Alexander Klein that shows the circulation routes of people in a traditional house versus the ones in his own improved modern and functionalist design on the right. So the problem I see with disabled people embracing or inadvertently upholding functionalist ideals is that disability itself is often a functionally defined category of human impairment. One of the ways disability is defined is when an impairment of some sort is determined to be insufficient and inefficient, often defined in very biomechanical terms. So in this sense, impairment becomes a negative, or to use a term from disability studies, it's a medical concept or what people call a medical model of human impairment. Now, when one interprets impairment in this way, one then has to resolve them by either transforming the offending features or non-functioning parts of somebody's body or mind, one has to then is compelled to transform the surrounding environment to make these quote-unquote inefficiencies or lack of functioning things function better. So this medical transformation makes an impairment into something that is more normative or that enables task completion. So my book has a few moments of memoir in it. So in that spirit, I want to describe an experience I had since publishing the book, actually. So just to explain this idea, if this needs a little bit more illustration. So I recently went through a numerical evaluation of my ability to ambulate, to move, by a physical therapist. something I haven't experienced in almost 35 years when I first became an amputee. So I was asked to walk back and forth, walk toe to toe, and to then climb steps. Some of you may have noticed me climbing steps here, so this is a good illustration. So according to this person, this man, I scored high, that is normal at most things. I could walk normally, I could walk toe to toe fairly normally, with the exception of climbing stairs. As you can see, I can climb stairs. So though I can climb steps, I was scored as deficient because I do not climb stairs like most people do. And this physical therapist then offered me two remedies. He would teach me how to walk stairs like the way I assume most of you walk stairs. Or he asked me, do you have any stairs at home? Because you can work with a caseworker who can install a ramp or something else so that you don't have to go through this thing that he imagined that I was going through. So this somewhat crude story helps illustrate how ideas about modifications and access emerge from a very mechanical interpretation of both impairments and design, and how this is applied to people who have impairments. So the value systems, I should just mention, for those of people that maybe have difficulty seeing, this is a very important space in the history of the development of accessible design in the United States. So the man on the right with the glasses is Timothy Nugent, who ran a rehabilitation lab at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. And here he's shown working with what's very likely a disabled World War II veteran and teaching this person how to walk more easily with the use of this apparatus within his lab. So the values of the physical therapist that I mentioned who was evaluating me, they're systemic. They're not unique to him at all, of course. And they appear in subtle ways also in the manners in which architects are expected or asked to address disability. And one way we experience that is through these kind of common diagrams that you see here of various design strategies that typically illustrate wheelchair, crutch, or blind cane users' kind of range of motion or the amount of space that they occupy within a room in these fairly anthropometric type of diagrams. So I'm not alone, of course, in seeing problems or tensions with the kind of crude mechanical or functionalism behind medical ways of engaging disability, or the simple ways that accessible design strategies and their imagery often depict the experiences of disability. So in the 1970s, the Berkeley-based architect and educator Ray Lifshitz sought to create a more ethnographic versus biomechanical understanding of disabled people's spatial needs. He turned to the emerging techniques of design anthropology to initiate a shift in how architects and architecture students would address disabled people. So where researchers, like Timothy Nugent that I showed earlier, photographed or filmed disabled people and the way they moved, Lifshitz asked his disabled subjects if he could attach a film camera to their wheelchairs, as you can see in this photo. These are photographs from Ignacio Galan's very important research on Ray Lifshitz. Lifshitz, with these subjects of his studies, created films and images from their point of view using a space. All of this was novel. No one had really, at least in architecture, had really studied disabled people's lives in this way. And so this can be contrasted with films or images of these people using a space, often by able-bodied observers. So he was still concerned with the problems of use, but it was a little less crude than some of the things that I showed you earlier. And I should just mention, Ray just passed away, and he lived into his 90s, and so really a pretty extraordinary person in the world of disability and design. Okay, so today and years later, my colleagues who are critical of the mechanical character of functionalist solutions to access often advocate for a more diversified approach to engaging disabled people. And these include approaches that advocate for what they call embodied or phenomenological approaches to access, or ones that bring a previous generation's ideas that you saw before to bear on a wider range of disabilities, such as this diagram you see of how to improve a space for the use of people who experience deafness. And that also relates to the use of American, or ASL, I should say, sign language, in the development of a plan of a space. So this, what I would call this more like diversified or inclusive functionalism, explores other ideas, how sound and tactility may aid a blind person's navigation of space, or how architectural and urban spaces might be redesigned to enable more efficient communication, as a diagram like this shows. So all of these approaches are welcome, of course, but I think we need to be aware of the ways that they inadvertently extend medical ideas about impairment into more and more of the surrounding built environment itself. So in the architecture of disability, I wanted to more fully challenge the way these utilitarian values find attachment to disabled people's lives. So in doing this, I found myself reflecting on many post-war writings of architectural and urban theory. One of the defining features of post-war architectural theory is its strong critique of applied social, economic, and medical science within architectural practice, what we might call the kind of anti-functionalism that often defines a lot of post-war architectural theory. So I'm referring to many different authors, and that many people in here I know very well, but just very quickly, for those of you who might be new to this subject, this kind of anti-functional writing, let's call it that, includes writings by French and German language people that, urban situationists and lettrists in the late 1950s, people like Guy Debord or Friedrich Stowasser, who called himself Unterwasser, some of you may have heard of him, Italian neo-rationalists, architectural theory and their concept of an architectural theory, their concept of an architecture of the city that critiqued functional urban designs, the concept of post-functionalism in the writing and practices of Peter Eisenman, and the neo-situationist concept of the event, among many, many other examples. So all of these authors confronted the de facto value or imagined ethics of solving an architecture problem that was presented in exclusively quantifiable terms. Several argued that our inner desires, our cultural or social or urban histories, or our inner and social conflicts are often left out of or eliminated in mechanistic approaches to architecture and city planning. So these kinds of authors certainly informed my thinking, but their imagined architectural alternatives, this image illustrates this well, are not necessarily useful when thinking about impairment or disability. So this is a image by probably one of the most famous, I hesitate to use that word, situationist architects, Constant, who is a Dutch artist and architect, and his vision of a city of ladders that you see here that's in MoMA's collection. So I would argue, and this image illustrates that well, some of them resort to extreme forms of physical athleticism in representing their ideas. And in addition to this image, I'm thinking of situationist and neo-situationist writing in particular. Much of this writing called on those who wanted to challenge modern urbanism to hoist themselves over and under the city, to climb buildings, descend underneath streets. The athleticism of a lot of anti-functionalism is pervasive and sometimes quite perverse, in my opinion, but it's also a key feature of this writing and a key feature of the kind of transgression that these authors are trying to initiate. So the kind of post and anti-functionalism of the New York architect and educator Peter Eisenman is much less physically intense, and the cover of my book responds to one of his most well-known constructions from the era when he was exploring an anti-functionalist theory of architecture, House 6. This is a very early drawing of that house that's owned by the Canadian Centre for Architecture, and I'll just explain it in just a second. So this suburban house was designed as the US war in Vietnam was coming to a close, and in many ways it represents a kind of deconstruction of the innocence of the US single-family home by reworking its constitutive practical elements. The house has a series of object-like architectural artifacts that one would expect to provide some type of use, but in which their utility is foreclosed or in which their use interferes with others. For example, in that building, and this illustration shows an early version of this idea, two formally identical staircases stand in opposition to each other, a right side up, usable stair painted green to imply go, go and use it, and an upside down staircase which is completely useless that's painted red, as in stop, you can't use it. This is probably the house's most discussed space, and I'm continuing that tradition tonight, and also one of its most photographed as well. So from another perspective, the perspective of impairment or disability, both stairs are equally useless, of course. In the cover of my book, the usable staircase is red, the upside down one is yellow because who cares, and the one turned 90 degrees and that resembles a ramp is green. But of course, it's not a representation of a usable ramp. It has no, way to function, obviously. It's just engaging in dialogue with the ideas within the original drawing. So there's also concepts within disability studies that challenge many of these kind of mechanical, or as I call them, functionalist definitions of impairment, but I don't think they found much of a role in architecture writing. So for example, there's something called the critical concept, or some people call it the critical model of disability, and that argues that most concepts of disability propose that impairment is always some type of lack or negative that must be addressed either medically, environmentally, or socially. The example that I gave of the physical therapist's interpretation of my impairments and his remedies for them is a good example of both a medical and a social way of thinking of disability. So by contrast, a critical concept or a critical model of disability argues that impairments are just another lens on being human. It's something that contributes to society and culture and to our idea of what being a human being is. So authors who adhere to these ideas use provocative terms such as deaf gain instead of hearing loss, or gaining blindness instead of losing sight. And these terms describe how language, writings, or works of art might move through and transform through disability perspectives, communicating through ASL or Braille, being able to read a novel in a pitch black room if you read Braille, something I'm assuming 99% of people in this room can't do, or experiencing works of art through touch. These are all things that most of us don't experience every day, but that are extraordinary capacities, so to speak, right? And if you want to know more about the critical models of disability, the writing of Georgina Klieg or the recent film work of Alison O'Daniel are good examples of gaining blindness or deaf gain, really inspiring work and artwork on my own thinking. So what I would call an even more critical concept or an even more critical model of disability, what sometimes people call disability justice, argues that disability is experienced unevenly with any kind of social, historical reality. And this, of course, is true. This presents a challenge to medical and social definitions of disability that are very little explored in architecture. Because if disability is experienced differently based on social structures, then disability is not primarily functionally defined, but dependent on one's race, gender, and class. So these critical and even more critical concepts of disability inform my thinking, but curiously, the adherents of these approaches, like many of the leaders of these kinds of ways of thinking, often still see architects or our relationship to engaging disabled people as a primarily utilitarian one. So by contrast, I would define an architecture of disability not as a concept of architecture that evaluates how well buildings function for disabled people, but it's something else. It's what I call a structural critique of architecture and architectural thought from a disabled perspective. So where most architects might explore the relative utility of their practices for disabled people, a disciplinary and structural critique of architecture re-examines how impairment and capacitation are already situated within architectural theories, histories, practices, pedagogy, and the production of architecture itself, as this image of Minoru Yamasaki climbing a very tall, rickety ladder to overlook his two very tall buildings that were about to be built in Lower New York illustrates very well. It's an image about capacity. So this relocates the problem of disability away from the sole problem of use of space by contemporary people and towards a consideration of how ideas and experiences of impairment and capacity permeate our discipline. So concepts of human impairment, weakness, and capacity are laced through a range of architectural subjects, including history, nature and landscape, urbanization, architectural form and environments, and tectonics and construction. And in some cases, these areas of architectural concept and practices are the origin site of incapacities, with construction being the most obvious. Many architects in the United States, for example, are unaware, I think, that building construction in the United States is the most disabling form of work by percentage of the workforce. So if you are a career construction worker in the United States, you have essentially an 80% chance of having a permanent impairment that will impact your ability to make a living for the rest of your life, an extraordinary figure that needs to be addressed. So you don't usually hear about that when people talk about like disability rights or disability justice or ideas of disability perspectives in architecture, but how could you not? So that lays out some of the ambitions of the book, but to shift and expand architects' engagements with impairment, but to also question existing practices. So let me just take a moment, take some water, sorry. So I also wanted to mention some of the things I thought about as a writer, and a little bit more briefly. So in developing this book project, I wanted to challenge certain physical qualities that move through research generally and architectural research more specifically. So I find that one of the more alienating qualities of architectural writings that I experience is what I call methodological athleticism. I realize that's a mouthful and it sounds like a lot, but in architecture, this usually involves authors recounting their experiences traveling, climbing buildings and sites, and developing a deeper knowledge from architecture through this activity. But it can also relate to the remoteness or extremes one undertakes in more archival work. Methodological athleticism simply describes the belief that the physical and mental intensity of one's explorations of buildings, or the design of buildings, as in the case of this image of Elliott Noyes, that gives one's work a self-evident and relative worth and a kind of intellectual intensity as well. I question that. By contrast, I wanted to develop a book that emerged from a more weakened point of view, my point of view, which is weakened. So, like the larger approach of the book, this is also inspired by critical understandings or models of disability. So throughout the book, I try to center the relative weakness of myself, and in some cases others, and in my explorations of particular topics as much as that's possible. And I can explain more about how that works in a minute when I show you one of the chapters. But generally, I take my or a colleague's quote-unquote weak interpretation of a site, space, or theory and place that in contrast to more well-known interpretations of such things, in which very, not to mention names, famous examples in which architects, explain how they climbed 6 stories of stairs to experience an important monument or something, and how important it is to do that. So one of the more direct ways one can experience this response to that kind of methodological athleticism is in how I handle the illustrations in the book. So a book like this is typically offered in an alternative format for blind and visually impaired readers. So in these alternative formats, the text is fed into a voice controller and that reads the content of the book at a speed of the blind reader's choosing. I don't know if any of you have any blind friends or colleagues, but when you listen, the case in one particular example, one of my colleagues, Georgina Klieg, who I mentioned earlier, listens to books that are recorded at extraordinary speeds that are completely incomprehensible to me. I don't know if any of you are young enough to remember the Chipmunks, but it's like practically at chipmunk speed, and you can listen to a book that fast. It's amazing. Okay, so generally an author attuned to the use of these tools will also include a digitally marked file with what's called alt text. I'm sure some of you have experience with this with websites and other things. And this explains the illustrations of a book that a sighted person can see. So it's usually a very simple description of what somebody like me can see with their eyes when looking at an illustration, but for a blind viewer. So often alt text is very crude. It would say, in this case, an image of a person climbing a ladder. There are several other ladders in the background. So I chose to create more extended forms of alt text, but they're not buried in a digital file that a sighted reader would never see. They form the general captions of the images. And additionally, when I was writing the alt text, I was writing it for color versions of these illustrations that were on like a big screen. So I realized when the book was published in black and white and very small that I was describing things that nobody sees because so much of the detail of these images can drop out. So it's not just that people with visual impairments have this particular experience. And then finally, for those of you who write, maybe most interesting from an author's point of view or a writerly point of view, I often place the alt text in the body of the writing, in the chapter itself, and extend it into page-long descriptions of the images and that are woven into larger narratives within the book. And it's another way in which we can understand that you can have a visual experience that's outside optical experience, a very important idea from critical writing in disability. So if the critical interpretation or model of disability that I mentioned earlier to you was a confusing idea, this is a very simple example of how anybody can gain blindness while reading this book. And I think for some people, it's a very unusual but then very interesting experience to read such an extensive image description as you're reading a book. Okay. So how am I doing on time, okay? Yeah, okay. All right, I'm just gonna, I think maybe another 15 minutes, 10, 15, okay. So among the chapters is the table of contents. So among the chapters, I thought I would briefly outline one of them, and it relates to the theories and methods that I just described. So the first thematic chapter of this book offers what I call a disability critique of the monument, and through a few different perspectives. So it presents a criticism of a contemporary practice that was really launched in Europe called, quote unquote, accessible heritage. And then it also responds to the kinds of aesthetics of history that are built into historic sites. And then finally, I elaborate how the practices of conservators whose work interests me very much, people that some of you may have heard of in here, like Cesare Brandi, Maurice Chabab, or Julian Chapuis. I don't know if these names mean anything to you, but I'll explain their work in a second. How their work enables us to imagine an alternative to accessible heritage, and that we can call the preservation of disability, the kind of coinage from this book. So this chapter begins with some reflections on very famous episodes of disability activism in and around the Capitol building of Washington, D.C., a building that I assume most of my readers know, and that people involved in disability rights know is the site of one of the most important disability protests in the United States in 1990. That 1990 event, now known as the Capitol Crawl, was an action by a multi-generational and multiracial group of disabled people, most with lower limb impairments. So about 20 people, maybe a little bit more of different ages, transitioned out of their wheelchairs or off their crutches and pulled themselves up the monumental west staircase of the Capitol building you can see here with their hands. Pretty extraordinary. I was trying to do some quick math. I was a teenager when this happened. I was actually invited to this, but I felt too much shame to actually, I was in a wheelchair at that point, to do something like this. So this is really an extraordinary event, not just as an act of protest, but overcoming ideas of like shame and in a very public way that a lot of disabled people, I think of my generation or older, have often have. Okay, so what were they protesting? They were protesting the delayed passage of the American with Disabilities Act, what's often abbreviated as ADA, a bill that would guarantee physical access to historic and public structures like the Capitol building, and among many others, and for disabled people. So the provocative protest forced a vote on this bill that was being delayed, and it passed just a few months later. The spectacle of this really forced the senators and congressmen's hands to pass it. So in the book, I use the example of the Capitol. I talk about that briefly, but I illustrate it with this 100-year-old image and to raise a very broad question. What is a disability critique of monuments? Is it solely about making such structures more accessible, or would it engage other concerns? Okay, so one of the things that's very ironic about that protest is that the Capitol building is actually what has been for 140 years one of the most quote-unquote accessible buildings in Washington, D.C. It was the first multi-story building in Washington to have a fleet, like, many elevators. Why? Because just like today, back then, congressmen and senators tend to be quite old, and they didn't want to walk up a bunch of stairs either. So it was a kind of an unusual place to stage this protest. Anyway, but in terms of thinking about a disability critique of monuments, the Capitol building is a very interesting case study. For example, it was constructed by enslaved craftsmen. More and more Americans are coming to terms with that history. It was also destroyed by British troops in 1812, completely razed to the ground. A lot of Americans don't know that or haven't been taught that. It was rebuilt right after that by enslaved craftsmen. And of course, on January 6, 2021, what we all know too well, it was violently occupied by right-wing paramilitaries and their allies. So, in thinking about a disability critique of monuments, I ultimately turned to several other well-known monuments in this chapter and that are central to architectural histories as they are to national ones, including this one, the Acropolis in Athens, Greece, to making a series of parallel and other points. Okay, so this site, which I assume most of you know, or all of you know, which is canonical in histories of architecture. It's canonical in histories of patrimony and histories of architectural preservation, as well as some of the staging ground for very early ideas about architectural preservation that have become instantiated. But it's also central to more recent debates over what constitutes accessible heritage and what that practice means. So accessible heritage, in the most simple sense, is the modification of historic structures so that disabled people can visit them and understand their histories. But it's also an idea about the relationship between history and disability, chiefly that one can balance the authenticity of a site with the contemporary additions that make it more usable for disabled visitors. And balance is the central upheld concept here. And you can see that idea in this photograph of an elevator on the north face of the Acropolis, in which the north face of the Acropolis is relatively left untouched, but this very rickety-looking elevator that was there until quite recently I think it was built in 2004 when Athens staged the Olympic Games. Is kind of applied somewhat lightly to the surface of the north face of the ramp. Okay. The irony of the pursuit of balance is that many sites of accessible heritage, that includes the Acropolis, but also others such as Saint-Denis or Invalides in Paris, all of these sites owe much of their historical authenticity to their engagements with impaired people. So for example, the Acropolis was once reached via a series of interconnected ramps, and it held several shrines that were visited by impaired worshipers specifically. In fact, there's still unearthing votives that relate to ideas about blindness and physical incapacity at the Acropolis and that are displayed in the museum. So this photograph by Mantha Zarmakupi, someone who collaborated with me on a project in and about the Acropolis, shows the ramp fragments in the foreground. This is all that survives here, here, and here of this monumental, huge series of earthworks and stoneworks that used to allow people to ascend up to it. The Roman, when this, around the year 0, all this was destroyed and replaced with a monumental staircase by Roman architects and engineers. So this monument, in a sense, holds a history of human impairment within it, even by contemporary ideas through which we consider people to be impaired. So in many cases, the physical inaccessibility of these sites is not an intrinsic aspect of them, has nothing to do with their authenticity as historical objects, but it's actually something that's built into them and to make them take on a romantic aesthetics of historicism. So for example, in much of the 19th century, the entrance or propylaea of the Acropolis was reached through numerous and entangled paths of varying steepness. Today, it's reached through a path designed by Dimitris Pikionis in the early 1950s. This winding path takes visitors up the site in a rubble-strewn and increasingly narrow and steep route. You can see the end of it here that terminates in a single-file path and a kind of quasi-staircase. You can see the steps underneath these people's feet. So one of the ideas that's moving through Pikionis' ideas, it reflects an idea that the experience of the past is one in which physical intensity is a form of knowledge of it. And it's an example of what I called methodological athleticism that I described earlier. Now, Pikionis didn't invent this idea. You can't pin this to him, of course. He simply gave it a very convincing and frankly very beautiful physical form. So monuments also hold other histories relevant to histories of impairment and disability, very broadly conceived. Many are sites of violence because they are historic sites, and many were and are violently transformed to represent singular concepts of history, or what's called in preservation terms temporal integrity. That's the idea that you transform a monument to represent one specific era or even moment in time. So for example, at the Acropolis, the Bavarian architect Leo von Klenze cleared evidence of Ottoman culture at the site as best he could, or as best as the people working under him could. This involved destroying the Ottoman village here and a beautiful mosque that was located inside the Parthenon. It also involved dispersing, and in some cases actually killing, the Ottoman village's residents who lived on top of the Acropolis. And all of this to transform the site into a pure image of Hellenic classicism. So the Ottoman cemetery on the site is one of the few remaining traces of its 19th century history, and it's adjacent, it's very close to the elevator access point on the north face that I showed earlier. So what I call the preservation of disability is a response to these different histories and practices. The preservation of disability considers how impairment, weakness, and experiences of violence might be a lens through which to reimagine historical preservation, reconstruction, and restoration. So in thinking through this practice, I'm almost finished, I drew on a diverse range of thinkers, the blind art theorist Regina Klieg that I keep mentioning, the curators Maurice Chabab and Julien Chapuis, and the restoration theorist Cesare Brandi. So Chabab, Chapuis, and Brandy were all concerned with the ways in which physical instability and trauma could be preserved into sites, into historic sites. So for example, Maurice Chabab is a very important Lebanese archaeologist and curator, preserved ancient artifacts in the National Museum's collection that were damaged in the Lebanese Civil War, but he preserved them in their damaged state. He refused to restore them, and he exhibited them in a way that wove their ancient and contemporary histories, the imprints of things like fire and bombs and artillery, onto them. He wove that all into a larger national history of Lebanese art. Julien Chapuis, who was very likely influenced by Maurice Chabab, undertook a recent curatorial experiment in Berlin in his exhibition, The Lost Museum, which exhibited figural artworks damaged during World War II in Berlin and that were never restored or couldn't be restored. So their physical condition blurred the line between conservation and physical rehabilitation, and many of the figural works of art that you can see here look like war-damaged bodies and were far too damaged to be restored. So what's very interesting about this exhibition, just very quickly, is that this stuff was all damaged during World War II, but was exhibited for the first time in its damaged state to the public in this exhibition. It was considered too emotionally wrenching to exhibit in previous years, often because many people who would come to the museum, had trauma from the war, and some in fact had, impairments or wounds, I guess one would say, that was too close, so to speak, to the works that were on display. A little bit too much connection between what one experienced and what one saw in an artwork. So finally, the Italian conservator Cesare Brandi explored how damaged and restored historic artifacts, many from war damage, might also be experienced in an indeterminate state. Cesare Brandi had nothing to do with this. He died decades before this was made. I'm just showing this building as an example of conservation or restoration practices that are very much inspired by the kind of theories that Cesare Brandi developed in the 1960s, 1970s, and early 80s. So Brandi called for preservation practices that would rely on our misperceptions, okay? So that, for example, this is a good example of his ideas, at a distance, a restored work looked no different than in its original condition. But on closer, as you got close to it, you would begin to see differences between the repair work and the original. And he wanted conservators to make that very self-evident. So again, he had nothing to do with this facade, but it just shows the influence of this thinking on restoration. But the idea is around like the trick of the eye, that you think you see something, then you come close, and it's not what you thought you saw. So this was an idea about conservation that relied on a beholder's optical perception of time and through their position in space. So I think one can enrich this idea by considering how conservation might also be experienced and even practiced differently through greater practices of physical and physiological indeterminacy. That sounds very fancy, by that I mean how this idea of misperception or optical disconnect or not seeing can be embraced as a kind of idea about how a particular conservation practice might be staged. So in the end, and we're reaching the end, I think a disability critique of the monument would continue to position historic monuments as vulnerable things in the manner that all the above conservators and curators have explored, and many others have explored as well. But I think where we can add something different to that discussion is that these vulnerable things can take on innumerable characteristics relative to the incapacities and weaknesses of both their conservators and their beholders. And the latter possibility is something I have not experienced. So this is an interesting site, just to conclude. This is a Cham ruin site in Vietnam that had a residence lived around it, just like at the Acropolis, and French archaeologists, when Vietnam was a French holding, cleared the site and integrated the monuments more or less back to their historic appearance. And this place was used by both the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese during the American War in Vietnam as a kind of staging grounds or a place to sleep. And the American Air Force really kind of ruthlessly bombed this place. And there's numerous craters like this that surround it. And what's very interesting is that the contemporary Vietnamese archaeologists that are part of the management of this site have chose to more or less leave these as they were and as a kind of record of the various things that happened here. Okay, that's enough. Thank you very much. I hope you get a chance to read this book, and thank you again for having me here. Yeah. Maybe we'll put on the cover when we speak. Yes. Okay.
Great. Maybe, I don't know, should we bring up the lights a little bit? Maybe there's just a little bit. There we go. All or nothing. It's all or nothing here.
Okay, hang on.
Testing. Great. David, thank you so much. I think this might be your third talk here at University of Toronto, Daniel's faculty. I don't know if we were called Daniel's faculty the first time.
Yeah,
but
maybe fourth. But
yeah, it's sort of one per
Yeah.
book, so I'm looking forward to the
Okay.
fourth book, no pressure, for that fourth visit. But really great, thank you for taking the time to walk us through a single chapter. Maybe while some of our guests and visitors are thinking of some questions, I'll take you up on your offer that you said at the beginning to speak a little bit about this idea of disabling form, if you can maybe, if we can tag a postscript onto your talk.
Yeah, okay. So one of the chapters is about architectural theories of form, and going back to very late 19th century German writing about what is architectural form, what is form. And much of that writing and much of the stuff that's been inspired by it all the way up to the present argues that form is a kind of empathy that occurs through our physical capacities and the thing that we're seeing. So for example, one appreciates the way that a building holds itself up because we can hold ourselves up, okay? And within that writing itself, some of that writing, there are ideas about incapacitation. So they use the word formless. The key writer here is somebody named Heinrich Wölfflin. They use the word formless to describe a kind of what they call an exhausted object and the exhausted state of the bodies that would relate to this. And what's interesting in the passage within that particular essay is a reflection that very much relates to what we've all just went through with COVID, or are still going through with COVID. He describes formlessness as akin to like a wheezing person who can't get up and can't breathe. I thought that was so interesting. And so I was thinking, well, I guess one, just like the other arguments I was making about monuments, the goal for somebody who has a kind of disability critique or disability politics about architectural aesthetics wouldn't be trying to make quote unquote accessible form, or that's fine, I have no problem with that, of course, but one would try to challenge the idea of form itself and the way that we're imagined to physically relate to things. So I'm very interested in I don't know if I'm interested in the idea of this idea of like impaired formlessness per se, but I'm very interested in what a counter to form would be, for example. So for example, let me just very quickly mention something. This idea of like ascension or uprightness or strength or vitality that moves through the idea of form is something that, of course, I'm very interested in challenging. So with my graduate students last semester, I was asked to teach a studio. And so the first exercise I had them do was to take controversial multi-story buildings in New York, like the Vessel or Raphael Vignoli's very thin and tall apartment tower, or many other very, either very tall or the Vessel's not so tall, just controversial buildings that represent this idea of form, and they had to reinterpret them in a one-story form, which was a lot of fun. So we made a kind of city that was like a counter-object to the concept of ascension. We called it the aesthetics of declension. So yeah, it was nice. Yeah, it was good. Yeah, instead of a pinup, we had a place down. We were really challenging the whole the physical setup that one experiences in a studio. Yeah.
I guess, or a throwdown, we could call it.
Throwdown, yeah. That sounds violent. Yeah.
Thank you for that. I think I might have the question asking mic, or maybe there's one out there, but I'm happy to tour around. There is one out there? Wonderful. Would love to take some questions from our patient audience who are here. Are there's some questions for David from the talk? Let's see, one to start with here, which would be great.
Hi, Ooh, sorry. Thank you so much, David. I read your book. It's really great. I'm an architect and I teach accessibility in design here in Toronto. And you kind of started talking about this, and I found this really interesting because the topic of disability studies in architecture is lacking. And this is like in the best form possible to say this. It's almost non-existent. And I would have liked to hear more from your experience as a professor and as a pedagogical sort of individual. How do you see or maybe envision a change in this sort of field? How would you propose, if it's whether what you're doing in studio or things that go beyond that, to kind of also bring these things beyond just code or your mechanical or medical versus social model, but to integrate the understanding of students of architecture, to take them to the next level of how do we take this ability and integrate it better into our designs and understanding of space?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I mean, there are many, okay, there are half a dozen really insightful colleagues of mine that work in areas of disability and architecture or disability and design. One of the things that's lacking is most of them do not have the experiences of being disabled, right? And I'd say more than 3/4 of them, 4/5 of them do not, okay? Or 5/6, because it's half a dozen. Yeah. So there's a limitation there, right? And I think one of the things that I'm very interested in, and have always been interested in, even before I started writing about this topic in more explicit ways, it was always like an implicit part of my practice, latent, but it's become obviously something that I'm much more comfortable talking about. But one of the things that's been exciting for me is to sort of meet other people, often who are much younger than me, who want to have careers as architectural academics or practitioners with very serious impairments. And a lot of them are doing amazing work. Chris Lang in the UK, Jordan Whitewood-Neal, this other guy's last name is Zlatka, I can't remember his first name, sorry. But there's like a whole kind of cast of younger practitioners and scholars who are really doing some fantastic things here. Like Chris Lang is, we're all interested in access. We can't not be, right? But we're all trying to figure out how to push things beyond this kind of utilitarian approach. So Chris Lang, for example, has created something called Sign Strokes in the UK, where he's trying to create new ASL or BSL signs for architectural elements. Like there's no sign for cantilever, for example. There's no sign for many of the things, the words that architects use in everyday practice. So one of his interventions has nothing to do with the use of space, but being able to practice architecture as somebody who's completely deaf. So I find that kind of practice really interesting. It's less about like disability studies per se, and it's simply like anything that involves the politics of representation, just having more and more people that bring this perspective in our profession or in academia, and showing the variety of ways they can deal with it, and also the very unexpected ways that they can deal with it. Very different than, let's say, how we may have dealt with disability in architecture before. Yeah. Yeah. Those are all great people to look up, by the way. They do really, really fantastic work. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you for that question. There's another one just a couple rows back with the arm up there.
Thank you so much, Professor. And I've read your book and reviewed your book as well.
Oh.
I would love to get your thoughts on the idea of, also elaborate on the idea of form. And you just mentioned the idea of formlessness and how it's kind of discriminatory and exclusionary. I'm also working on the concepts of architectural form, but more in the lens of informality. And so I was wondering if you're thinking about these kind of intersectionalities with the global south, thinking it more as like a global issue in this kind of exclusionary nature of the development of the concepts of form. Thanks.
Yeah. Thanks for the questions. Thing has a weird echo. Okay. Reverb. So in that chapter, I refer to some other authors who have also critiqued form from the perspectives of race, let's say, or other ideas about physiology. So yeah, I mean, that chapter isn't the best example of that approach, but it's in it. But I think, for example, the chapter in the book on cities and the quote-unquote urbanization of disability, it's a little bit critical of a lot of the, or some of the disability activism staged in the US, which was often like young white wheelchair users and what they wanted out of urban space, which was essentially to use cities like anybody else and to move and circulate through urban space and really, I would argue, inadvertently reinforce the idea that cities are fundamentally places about circulation and movement, right? I would think a disability critique of cities would challenge the premise that the primary role of a city is one that upholds circulation above all. So to develop that idea, I had to turn to a lot of thinkers outside the United States, outside of Europe, outside of Canada, people working in India, people doing work in West Africa, people doing work in South America, where the experiences of colonization, for example, have changed some of the values that have been built into historic cities around things like streets, but also water systems and things like this, and trying to recover pre-colonial concepts of cities that may have nothing to do with circulation, have ideas about stoppages or waves or metaphors that, for example, you don't really see in the United States, and that I think would be very useful from a disability perspective on cities. So I think in that particular chapter was most successful in creating what you call an intersectional approach in the book, and it's something that, yeah, I definitely wanted to stage. So, yeah. Oh, okay.
Some other hands popping up in this row. Yes.
Hi, thank you very much for the talk this evening. I wanted to, two things was the idea about disability itself and the fact that there seems to be an ever-increasing number of people who find themselves to be defined in part by their disability.
Yeah.
It's part of their character. And that seems to be, the Disabilities Act actually says disability is an evolving field, and the definition of who's disabled is changing as we move forward. The part that I loved about your book was the urban design part. And what if you could comment a bit on that? Because the idea about the things that we take is it's good urban design, makes streets as sunny as possible, is a problem.
Yeah.
So I just wondered if you could maybe give a couple more examples of that.
Yeah, thanks for mentioning that. By the way, thank you. I really thank you so much to everybody who's read the book. It really means a lot. It's great. Thanks. It's cool. Thanks, Alex, for promoting.
All the hard work.
Okay, so yeah, very quickly. So in 2019, I was invited to be, that's what you're referring to, invited to be part of a project in Vienna, Austria called Hitze, or Heat in German, and in which they asked me to, I hadn't published this book yet, but I was working on it, but they asked me to revisit some ideas from this book that I wrote 15 years ago called Subnature, relative to some of the ideas they were interested in dealing with in Vienna. So Vienna, like many cities, is experiencing pretty intense heat gain. In 1950, I think there were what they call 5 heat days, 5 days where temperatures, I know we're in a Celsius country, but I'm going to use Fahrenheit, forgive me, 5 days where temperatures reached 90 degrees Fahrenheit or higher. In the past, well, in 2019 and earlier, you can convert while we're up here live. Okay, it was 90 degrees or higher for 30 days of the year. Okay, so the city and the school that I was working with, this university, sorry, were interested in how architects might respond to this. There's plenty of landscape strategies for dealing with heat, planting trees, et cetera, some of which work, some of which don't. So our group studied, and I brought my students from Yale in on this project as well. Our group studied how the modernization of Vienna involved the increasing exposure of urban space and interiors to sunlight. The process is called solarization. Okay, I'm sure it's very common in Toronto. It's the building codes in New York City that were changed to create staggered building profiles and tall buildings and setbacks. These are all enacted to enable more sunlight to reach interiors in urban space. Okay. In Vienna, the process of solarization was associated with ideas about physical betterment and kind of invigorating the body, fighting disease, of course, among many, many other ideas. And the problem, one of the reasons the heat problem in Vienna is so intense is because so much of the urban space has been rebuilt around this principle. So our group studied how one could sort of, to use, I guess, the critical terms I was mentioning earlier, kind of gain gloominess or gain darkness in the city, right? A pretty provocative idea. And so we looked at building codes, we looked at strategies to use architecture to create like a narrow street profile, we looked at pre-modern, like Baroque era, not medieval, but Baroque era, like 18th, very early 18th century and late 17th century street structures in which the street profile was much more narrow, but the ventilation and light was actually fine. And so what was interesting was that the city was doing very parallel work to ours. I can't take any credit that we influenced them at all, but today in Vienna, they're revisiting the building code to make a narrower street profile, much, like really significantly narrower compared to what we think of as a broad modern street profile. And it's so provocative still because people associate these kinds of streets in which the shadows cast almost to the other side of the street or which seem kind of gloomy as unhealthy. It's not unhealthy for you, right? And in fact, today it results in a slightly less, some improvement of heat that doesn't rely on people maintaining plants and trees, which often doesn't necessarily go so well. So that was a really great project, and it's an example of where like something that was associated with like sickliness or unhealthiness, again, things that relate back to earlier work of mine, could be recovered and rethought as a kind of urban good, right? So yeah, that was thanks for mentioning that. That was a exciting project to work on. Yeah.
Thank you. There's another question right here in this row, and then we can go. Is there a microphone closer here? Oh, yeah.
Thank you so much for your presentation. I found it very valuable, especially the idea of thinking of disability like differences in human experience. I'm a tech professional, and I love to use these kind of ideas in my tech designs as well. So I just wanted to know, how can we anticipate all the differences in human experience when designing both architecture and technical design? I guess you can speak more to architecture. The reason I ask is because there are new disabilities that we don't anticipate that come up all the time, right? How can we plan so that we are inherently building something that is inclusive to both things we can anticipate and things we can't?
Yeah, I don't have a good answer to that question. That's a very big question. I'm gonna kind of, your question raises some issues for me that are sort of like buttons, So, it's very interesting. Like architecture has a very unusual relationship to the idea of design, right? Right now I teach in a design school, and I think, there were architects in the 70s and a little earlier than that made a very strong distinction between architecture and design, right? Really trying to distance themselves between the way design got appropriated into kind of commerce and consumerism, right? And so architects often said, well, we deal with this very deep history that precedes industrial design by thousands of years, and architecture is related to design, but it's not design. And I've always been very attracted to that idea that there's something about architecture that's a little apprehensive about just being a quote-unquote design discipline, right? It's a historical discipline. It's an urban discipline. It involves any number of things. Okay, engineering. I think that what would be exciting to see for disabled people is to free themselves from being the constant object of designers' focus. Now, I don't know how you do that, but with my students at Parsons, I'm very interested in thinking about design, I teach a course called The Design of Disability, in which the last unit of is exploring ways that disabled people, artisans, archaeologists, others have freed themselves from design being such the focus of the physical engagement with disabled people through artifacts and looking at other fields. Again, I just said archaeology, anthropology, other things, curatorial work like I just showed. So I'm more interested in that. I'm a little concerned about us becoming completely absorbed into the world of designers. And I think like how you can be free of the designers' work would actually be a very interesting possibility. I know that's not what you want to hear, but but I think there's something there that it's a button for me, Yeah, because the promise of universal design is that everybody with every kind of disability, gets incorporated into our work. It's frightening to me, I don't think that's possible. And is that what we want, right? That seems strange, yeah. I apologize. I appreciate the spirit of your question, yeah.
That's okay. I appreciate your perspective.
Okay, yeah.
We have another one in the back, in the slope row.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Gissen. I haven't read your book yet, and really I'm just over here, looking forward to engaging with it. I'm, to kind of gauge a better understanding of my point of departure for my question is I'm recently completed my PhD in disability studies here at the University of Toronto, and with my peers also doing disability studies. So really exciting to hear how you're in conversation with thinkers and scholars in disability studies as you kind of engage and explore different ways of maybe opening architectural thought, as you were saying. So my question or my provocations are kind of like two-pronged. My first being really intrigued by this weakened perspective that you bring up, and I'm wondering if that's at all in conversation with crip theory, where crip has been reclaimed by some scholars in disability studies. So I'm wondering whether weakened is a kind of a reclamation of what weak might mean otherwise.
Yeah.
Second part of my question is, I think one of the most perhaps generative spaces or maybe generative offerings of disability studies is the opening of how we understand the body.
Yeah.
And when I think about, again, I'm not coming from architecture to folks in the room, but, when I think about buildings and I think of edges and disability perceived as kind of the edge of life, they're really in conversation with Dr. Chichkovsky, who talks about that. So just wondering how you think of how you've been made to think differently, perhaps, about the body, the edges, its borders.
Yeah.
What is the body? There. That's all. Thank you.
Yeah, it's great. Yeah, no, it's great. So all the references I was mentioning earlier, of course, were very familiar to you. Tanya Tchaikovsky's work and those are all very important to my own thinking, and was really refreshing to me because I only had really knowledge of architecture people that wrote about this topic, so it really opened up so much. Is the mic's coming through if I hold here? Okay, great. One way I think we can think about the idea of weakness or and physiology, let's say, is through some of the writing in this book and an interest of mine in like weak nature or weak environments. Okay, so it's an example also of like how one can cultivate a politics that's kind of more than human, I guess we could say, also in thinking about bodies, roughly speaking. So one of the things that provokes me again is the way that the climate crisis has inspired a kind of ideas about capacitation in biology, right? So, for example, it's not just that, certain kinds of people who are young and healthy will obviously have much easier time with things like heat gain, among many other kinds of calamities that we may or may not experience in the near future, but also that certain kinds of species or biological artifacts or beings have value relative to these crises that we're facing. So, for example, certain trees are good because they absorb more carbon than others and give off oxygen. Certain kinds of shellfish are good because they clean the waterways of New York City. I find the entire evaluative framework that, let's say, the climate crisis has created to be very frightening, okay? And almost like soft eugenic, And I often think, like, who's there arguing for the weak physiologies, not just the people that we examined in Vienna, the disabled and elderly people that are having such a hard time with heat there, but also, thinking very broadly about, things that don't have any clear role within the kinds of environments that people are interested in setting up to respond to the climate crisis. So this idea of weakness, I think, can be a very powerful politics. In terms of the word crip, I mean, having given lectures in LA on my work, I do not feel comfortable standing up there and saying, I'm a crip. So, as, an aged white man. So, I can't use that word with a straight face. So I use the word weak or impaired. Sometimes works like disfigured, but the word crip, I just can't. I can't go there. Yeah. But I appreciate people that use that word. But I do think a lot of authors that use that word should think about the contexts in which they use that, because it has a lot of different meanings, particularly in the United States and some cities. Yeah. So.
Very fair. Very fair. I think it's a testament to the kind of reach of your book, David, that not only so many people have read it that are in the audience and they're here to hear you speak specifically to a chapter or two, and to hear it directly from your mouth and from your mind here in presence, and as well as people coming from technology sector and disability studies. I think it's great that we can fill a room with that kind of diversity. So with that last question, I'd like to conclude tonight's event. Thank you again, David, for being here with us, and my thanks to all of you for coming out this evening. Before we disperse, I just want to quickly remind everyone about the next two events in our public program series. Next Wednesday, 5 o'clock, the exhibition by an architect you may have heard of called Le Corbusier, called Le Corbusier Models, will kick off in our Larry Rain Richards Gallery, which is just behind the main hall here. This exhibition, the faculty's rendition of a traveling exhibit showcasing the buildings of Le Corbusier, features dozens of scaled models by the Swiss-French architect's work. And then the following week at 6:30 on October 12th, mark your calendar, the faculty's Claire Zimmerman and Emory University's Christina Crawford will be here in the main hall to discuss their latest book, Detroit, Moscow, Detroit, An Architecture for Industrialization, 1917 to 1945. The book explores how capitalist and communist built environments were co-produced during the early 20th century, a period of intense technical exchange, and their lecture will be dedicated to the memory of their co-editor, Jean-Louis Cohen, who passed away earlier this year. And now I would like to invite you all to join us for some refreshments, and David's going to join us as well in the student commons here to my right, just through the north doors. Have a good evening, and hope to see you all here again soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.